Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to have Ambassador Rajiv Dogra join us today. Ambassador Dogra had an illustrious career in the Indian Foreign Service. He was, for a time, a man in the United Nations. And today I specifically asked him to join me in this conversation because he put out his opinion on the social media platform, erstwhile Twitter, now X, talking about the island of Katchatheevu, which of course is off the coast of Tamil Nadu, and the controversy that's broken out between Sri Lanka and India about who owns this island and whether India willingly at one point, really donated this island to Sri Lanka. To discuss all of this today, joining me is Ambassador Dogra. Thanks very much, sir, for your time.
My pleasure.
To begin by asking you, taking off from the comments that you made on the Twitter, talk us through a little bit about what you really think happened and what the records show about whether India, quote unquote, as the TV channels are calling it, donated this island to Sri Lanka.
Well, I think donated, for one, is a wrong term to use, because you donate to a temple, you donate to a cause, you donate to the needy. Sri Lanka was neither needy, nor it had a cause, nor was it begging for donation. It was persisting with its demand that Katchatheevu belongs to Sri Lanka. And finally, Sri Mao Bandaranaike, who was leading Sri Lanka at that time, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi in India. So she used the emotional strings, and she appealed to Mrs. Gandhi to say that, look, I'm having political problems. Can you please step out of the bureaucratic red tape and tell them that Katchatheevu has to be given to Sri Lanka? Now, unfortunately, Mrs. Gandhi, who had an admirable record in foreign policy, especially in 71, succumbed to this appeal to her heart and to her emotions, and decided to overrule the diplomats of that time and to gift it to Sri Lanka, or to give it to Sri Lanka. Now, my objection to all this in the tweets that you mentioned is very fundamental, that even an inch of Indian territory, as per the Indian Constitution, cannot be given, gifted, or donated, as TV channels are saying, without amending the Constitution. So if you want to give an inch here, a yard there, a meter there, every time, regardless of the size of the Indian territory, you have to go to the parliament and get the Constitution amended to that extent. If I remember right, it is Article 368, but I may be mistaken. Now, that was not done. So people who are saying that, you already signed an agreement with Sri Lanka, how can now you dishonor it, are mistaken, because an agreement has validity once it is ratified according to the law of the state, in this case, India. Now, that law has not been completed. The amendment to the Constitution has not taken place. So, first, India is not bound by that 1974 agreement. Further, there was a subsidiary agreement in 1976. Neither of these bind India, because we have not undertaken the necessary prerequisite requirement that needed to be completed, namely amendment to the Indian Constitution.
There's another angle to all of this, of course, Ambassador. Partly because of that island, there has been constant conflict between India, Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan forces, Sri Lankan fishermen, and Indian fishermen. By some estimates, 6,000 Indian fisher people have been arrested at some point or the other by Sri Lanka. This is the ongoing battle that keeps happening, that keeps popping up in the news. The resolution of what happens with this island perhaps could resolve this perpetual battle on fishing between the two countries. Is that correct?
Well, I think that is part of the problem. In fact, even according to this agreement, Indian fishermen had the right to dry their nets there in that particular island, even after 1974. So, for fishing boats to go there should not be any unlawful activity according to the agreement with Sri Lanka side. The second question which I want to ask is that 6,000 Indian fishermen are rotting in Sri Lankan jails. How many of Sri Lankan fishermen are imprisoned in Indian jails? Has anyone made a comparative study of this and written about it? Now, you might say that, Indian fishermen go deeper beyond Katchatheevu into Sri Lankan territorial waters. That may be correct, but so do Chinese. So do some of the European trawlers. In fact, Chinese do immense harm by trawling deep and damaging the seabed around Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka does not arrest any Chinese fishermen or any European fishermen. So the question that we must ask ourselves repeatedly is, why are Indian fishermen being singled out for this rough treatment? And why can't we arrest wherever they are, even if they are just close to the Indian territorial waters and not entirely infringing them? We should, as a reciprocal measure, tell Sri Lankans that enough is enough. You cannot randomly keep on arresting Indian fishermen who may, because of the weather, have strayed onto Sri Lankan waters.
So, of course, brings up another point, isn't it, Ambassador? You mentioned China, you brought up China. Now, there's a history to this, of course. Sri Lanka's participation in some form or the other in the BRI, the control of Sri Lanka's most important port going into Chinese hands, the Sri Lankan economy subsequently going down the drain, India bailing out Sri Lanka with a very large amount of money, billions of dollars, in fact, the Sri Lankan economy. All of this is on record. And yet this fishing, this fishing battle, so to speak, continues. Fishermen continue to be arrested, and as you correctly pointed out, this doesn't happen to China. How do we put all of this in perspective, keeping keeping the context of recent history in mind?
Well, I think that's a very important question, and it needs to be debated seriously within India, because we've not debated enough or long enough, or in all its validity and angles. The first question that arises is, has Sri Lanka been honest with us? When it says that no Chinese survey ship, which is really spy ship, so to speak, no Chinese survey ship would be allowed to dock in Sri Lankan ports. Now, that they abided by for a few months, but the recent reports suggest that Sri Lanka has made it quite clear that Chinese ships, including survey ships, would be allowed docking facilities. So is that a sign of sincerity by a state which was bailed out to the extent of $4.5 billion by India? A state which went under because of Chinese Shylockian terms of lending money. So, number one, can we really trust Sri Lanka in the long run, medium run, and even immediately? Supposing some friction develops between China and India, will Sri Lanka abide by the gentleman's agreement that it will not allow Chinese warships to use Sri Lankan ports? I don't know. The jury is out on that because of Sri Lankan's past performance. The second thing is another disturbing report which has come out today by some strategic analyst, where he says that in Coco Island, which does not concern Sri Lanka. It concerns Myanmar and China. In Coco Island, which is very close to our strategic facilities in the south, China and Myanmar have built a second airstrip which can take in fighters and all kinds of aircrafts. And there are other facilities which are rumored to be there in Coco Islands. And all that, as I said, is of vital importance to what we have in Andamans. Now, what is to rule out the possibility that at some future date, China would also use Katchatheevu Island with Sri Lankan nod for its radar facilities, for satellite tracking facilities, or even for berthing of its survey ships. So the issue that concerns India and that should concern us as people of India is much deeper, because you can say that today nothing exists there except a church and so on, but nothing existed in Coco Island except for a couple of years back. And suddenly it is full of activity of the kind that should worry us. So 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, Katchatheevu may pose similar and much larger problems, strategic problems, security problems for us in, let's say, Tamil Nadu. So today we are debating the consequences of a decision made by Mrs. Indira Gandhi in 74. It's nearly 50 years. But tomorrow, 5 years down the line, we may be in a similar quandary, debating similarly as to why didn't we take action when action was due on Katchatheevu Island.
Let me paint two scenarios for you, Ambassador, and if you would please bear with me. There are two things here. Some people would say, well, like you said, 50 years have gone by. India is a rising power. India needs to demonstrate more than ever before that it follows its own norms, its own promises, its own, things that it settled in a sense, with past governments. And if today the message is that such decisions can be reviewed even after 50 years, then what is to say that today the decisions that have been taken by an incumbent government in India will not be similarly reviewed decades later? That's question number one part. The second part is the part that you painted out. There are many security concerns from Sri Lanka. There is a rise of all kinds of militant activities in some parts of Sri Lanka. There are nefarious elements within Tamil Nadu who every now and again talk about breaking away and splintering India. That Chinese influence in an island close by from Tamil Nadu would try to trigger some of these influences, or perhaps even worse, comes as, or should come as, no surprise to anybody. And this is certainly something we should be scared of. How do you balance these two things? How do you balance these two arguments?
Well, one is the internal issue, domestic issues, and I would rather not get into that because my expertise is not there. And on the whole, I would say that Tamil Nadu is as much India as Delhi is, or Jammu and Kashmir is, or Punjab is. But having said that, let me come to the other question, which I had touched and you have mentioned just now, is whether national borders, national boundaries have remained the same throughout the world from the time that boundaries came into existence. No, certainly not. Have all agreements been honored in the manner they should from the Greek times, Roman times, Chanakya's times, and early Chinese times and so on? Certainly not. Because if they had been honored and if they had stuck to the letter of the agreement or convention, then Tibet would not have gone to China. Falklands would not have gone to UK. Diego Garcia should have been the Chagos archipelago, should have been returned to Mauritius, which is its due. But both America and Britain refused to do it. So history is full of surprises. History is full of concessions, rights, which are determined by the powerful. So for anyone to say that India should stick by the letter of agreement, it is a good view, but it is not a view that is supported by historical evidence in the world around us. If a wrong has been committed, which was the center point of your question, by a government, be it the present government or the previous government or Mrs. Gandhi's government, then the future generations need not suffer forever. If it was a flawed agreement, then we have every right to rework that agreement and to ensure that just like Mrs. Bandaranaike appealed to Mrs. Gandhi, who readily agreed to that appeal, similarly, India can reverse that appeal and appeal to Sri Lanka that, sorry, a wrong had been committed. Now, for a variety of reasons, we think we need to relook at it, primarily because this agreement was signed without proper ratification within the Indian system.
I spoke about, breakaway factions or breakaway tendencies in the dialogue in Tamil Nadu. I, of course, was talking about, not mainstream at all, but certain elements. And what I tried to, refer to essentially was Chinese influence, for instance, in Manipur. We know in the Northeast the kind of influence that, China has had in stoking trouble, in fomenting trouble. Similar things perhaps could happen in other parts of India. Now, I want to ask you, Ambassador, how is it, knowing what we know about Coco Islands, knowing what we know about the Habantota port in Sri Lanka, knowing what happened to the Sri Lankan economy, in part because of Chinese influence and debt, how is it that the question of how important the Katchatheevu Islands are to India's security, how is it that this has never come up before, in public dialogue at least?
Well, part of the reason is that we are so busy managing day-to-day affairs that serious questions, even of the type of, let's say, Arunachal Pradesh, have not attracted the kind of debate that it should, let's say, over the years. So similarly, Katchatheevu, a small island, as Pandit Nehru put it, off the coast of Tamil Nadu, was difficult to pronounce for many of us and to locate on the geographical map as to where this tiny speck of an island is. So our attention was focused on the immediate, problematic, and the urgent. And for many years, it meant the situation across the line of control. Over the last few years, the attention has been divided between LOC and LSC. So these are major issues. And please don't forget that for nearly 30 years, this nation, our India, was subject to the worst kind of terrorism in the world. There were moments when people sort of gave up in despair or were about to give up in despair that, is becoming far too problematic and we may not be able to handle it. But ultimately, the Indian will triumph, both in J&K as well as in Punjab. And terrorism has been met with resolute action. But in all this, there was no scope or no possibility to give attention to issues like Katchatheevu.
So, Dogra, I also want to ask you, you mentioned the militancy in Punjab and in Jammu and Kashmir. But of course, since we are discussing China, we cannot forget that it was only a few years ago that the sitting Prime Minister of India was referring to the internal problems or the internal militancy in our country, Maoist militancy, should I add, as the single biggest security challenge of the country. And that Maoist militancy, we know, had direct links with China. So, considering we know that, this, would you not say, this problem of the Katchatheevu Islands and others like it, considering what is happening even today in Manipur, should even more be highlighted? We should be even more concerned about it.
Well, naturally, as I said, that if the framers of Indian Constitution had thought it in their wisdom that even a single inch of Indian territory should not be given away without amending the Constitution, that means that they had thought through the entire issue and sketched out an elaborate method by which discussion must take place in Parliament, and thereafter, only with the requisite majority, should such a step be considered. So, whether it is Katchatheevu or another island somewhere in Indian Ocean, if it belongs to India, then naturally the attention and debate is necessary. But as I said earlier, we are at the moment in the middle of a geopolitical storm, not just around India, but in the world, which is quite unpredictable in its consequences and its direction. I mean, if it is Israel, Hamas today, or Russia, Ukraine yesterday, it could be, let's say, China, Philippines, or China, Taiwan tomorrow, or even China, India, or Pakistan, India, or any other theater. So the point here is that how much attention can you afford to give to every issue of your concern? And the other point is that yes, every Indian territory, whether ceded rightly or wrongly, is a matter of concern. But is this the right time? Is this the right occasion? That the government has to determine.
As we come towards the end of our conversation, Ambassador Dogra, let's touch upon an issue that is fundamental to all that we have been talking about, the issue of India's sovereignty. Even today, in 2024, a lot of people, a lot of Indians don't realize that there are many questions of geographical sovereignty in India that still remain open and unresolved. And that actually puts us in a position of great vulnerability in many, many ways. Talk to us a little bit about this unfinished business of India's sovereignty and why that, as a single point agenda, does not get enough public attention and indeed also government attention.
Well, I think the first fundamental point is that somehow governments, I don't mean just Indian government, governments across the world think that it is better to keep sensitive issues in a parda. But as the world is discovering, as the world is progressing towards, instant communication, not just within borders, but across borders through social media, secrets are no longer sacrosanct. And the decisions, national decisions, are no longer the monopoly of a few. Once again, let me qualify, I don't mean it about India, but every country and every people in various countries now want to have a say in the national destiny. They may not be able to have full participation, but they want to be aware as to where the country is heading on important issues. Their voice may be heard or may not be heard, but at least they feel that they should be given an opportunity of trying to express their views. And that is what social media is all about. The second thing is that how long can any state or any government keep issues under a lid? For example, if there was Kargil, now there were two options available, that as the intrusion had taken place over a couple of months and no one knew about it. So the government could have chosen to keep it quiet, take no action, and forget about the consequences. But somewhere down the line, people would have discovered, just like that shepherd discovered and raised the alarm in case of Kargil. So the national debate, national outrage, national alarm would have followed. So times have changed. And it is in the interest both of the government and of the people and for the country as well that the parda should be lifted to the largest extent possible. It's not possible in all cases and to the greatest extent in every case, but at least give people a chance to participate in national destiny. You've been mentioning repeatedly about China and its excessive interest in the Northeast. And the fact is that people in Northeast are aware of what Chinese designs are. It is not something which has been communicated and discussed in rest of India because, as I mentioned earlier also, there are too many issues on the plate. But somewhere down the line, Chinese actions could become a real headache for rest of the country also if it persists in its designs. I'm not saying that it is successful, or I'm not saying that it is continuing with a large amount of intensity in its interference, but it is better to be alarmed and to be aware in the beginning rather than to worry about it when the fear of consequences has already become very large.
Let me end by then asking you what happens from the point we began. What happens next in the Katchatheevu Island debate? In your mind, what are India's options? What could be Sri Lanka's counters? Where are we likely to go on this island, in the weeks and months to come?
Well, I think firstly we have to be sure ourselves whether all the procedures had been completed. I mean, whether parliamentary approval, amendment to the constitution, and so on, and debate in parliament, all that had been done. If that had not been done, then it needs to be done now because we have otherwise sat on something which is illegal as per our own constitution. So can we continue to persist with that illegality? The second thing is that even if, now I'm taking the extreme point, even if all that had been done in 74 before the agreement was signed, if a mistake was made and if our strategic interests are at stake, we have to take up the matter with Sri Lanka through dialogue, through diplomacy, and if necessary, by the ultimate means.
Ambassador Dogra, thanks very much indeed for joining me in conversation today to talk about the critical Katchatheevu Island issue that's boiling up, heating up all around us. We will wait to see what happens on this issue in the weeks and months to come. But thank you very much for your time in explaining these details to us. Thank you.
Thank you, and you're most welcome. Thank you.